So there we were. Paul and I were in the forest doing this great video on how to go over logs. And as I was in the air, flying through the sky, I thought, what could I possibly do as a bonus lesson? So stick around, I'll tell you what happened.
Here's the step-by-step process for crossing obstacles. We just add speed and fly over the top. All right, folks. So this is pretty typical of some of the obstacles that we may encounter out on the trail. And whether we're looking at logs like this, or roots, exposed roots, or rocks, or anything like that, turns out the technique is the same for all of them. When we're looking at the height of the log here versus where the center of the tire crosses that axle line, anything below that is what we call the rolling contact point. And if you'll notice on this one, where the tire actually makes contact is down here, which is well below the axle. So if we have enough momentum, we can just plow over the top of this thing with very little technique. Might be a little rougher ride, but this is why we practice technique on the smaller obstacles. If your technique is good here, it's going to work out if you get into something larger. You probably noticed that this one is a little larger. Technique is critical on this. If you'll notice where the axle lines up against the log, that we're not going to be able to get over the top of this thing just by rolling through it. If you just try to add some speed and roll over this one, let's just say it's going to get festive. As we approach this obstacle, if it's a smaller one like this, you can carry more speed because you'll just bounce over the top of it. It'll be rather abrupt and your bags will go flying, and if you've got anything loose, you're going to find out right then. The taller the obstacle, the slower your approach speed. Most people think that the bigger the obstacle, the more speed you have to carry as you approach. That is so wrong. As we approach this obstacle, the weight shifts back and we add a little blip on the throttle. And what we're trying to do is extend that front suspension so that we can absorb some of that energy. Because again, just like on a bicycle, we don't want to bend our rim. We don't want that hard hit. If you've ever ridden a bicycle up a curb, it's very similar to that. We tend to add a little bit of power and pull back on the handlebars and lift that front wheel up so that we don't get a hard hit and bend our rim. And then as soon as our front wheel's up on the sidewalk, you shift your weight forward and you lift up on the pedal so that your back wheel doesn't take a big hit. It's a little different on a motorcycle because you can pull on the handlebars all you want. All you're going to do is make your arms longer. So by extending that suspension and shifting our weight back, we lessen the impact on the front wheel. Now, as we come up here, our front wheel's going to hit, the bike is going to come up towards you, which is going to allow your arms to bend. As you come over the top of it, the clutch goes in. Otherwise, you'll end up way down range because your back tire is going to hit and launch you off of it. So about the time your back tire is going to make contact, clutch goes in, momentum carries you over the top, and as soon as your back wheel hits the ground again, you'll be back in that neutral riding posture that we are consistently talking about, and then you add power and ride away.
The technique Paul talked about is the basic technique no matter what the obstacle is. But there are things that make it more complex or add an extra element of challenge. In this case, when I go to clear the obstacle, I have a second obstacle on the other side. And this one rolls and moves, which means if I roll the front tire over and it hits this obstacle, it's going to roll out of the way. That's going to be a no-go. Even if this was just a ditch or a pile of rocks or even an embedded log on the other side, it's still going to be an issue. As soon as that front tire comes over off of this side, it's going to change the rake and trail of the motorcycle. It's less likely to self-correct and to straighten out. I need to clear both. This is the obstacle, not this. And the difference is not the approach, not the speed, not the technique, but the throttle and the objective. When I'm looking at where I need to end up, I need my front tire and my back tire to be on the other side of whatever this barrier is. When I roll up with that throttle, that blip that Paul mentioned, I'm not just blipping to offload the suspension. I need it to rebound and then accelerate into this log and then roll up and over. Now, if you just hammer the throttle, this is going to be a problem. If you come across this fast, that's not the idea. You're going to plow into this. You still have a slow approach. You add that throttle, it lifts up that front end, and then I continue to roll on the throttle so as that back end hits, it launches the motorcycle up and over. If I'm going fast, it plows in, the back end kicks up. I'm not trying to go really fast on the throttle. It's still a steady roll on because I need the traction to launch the bike. The rest of the technique is the same. Nothing else matters. We just have to think bigger.
So on a taller obstacle, you'll notice the rolling point is above our axle. One of the techniques that we can use is what we call a kicker or a ramp. In this case, it's more of a ramp. What this will do, as the bike rolls forward, if you push forward, you'll see that our contact patch on the logs that we put in front of the wheel are below the axle again. That lets us roll up onto this log, which brings our axle height up to the top of this so that we can clear the second log. Come on, more motor. More motor. You got to blip more. So if we were under power and that little blip, we would carry that momentum all the way up and let the back tire hit this and continue that drive. If you just try to roll up and over the top of this, your skid plate's going to hit on this log. And if it hits on this side, it will stop you right on this side, which means your feet are up in the air. You may not be able to reach the earth, well, with your feet. You'll eventually reach the earth with some part of your body. So we need to be able to carry that momentum, and that's where that blip comes in, and we want the back wheel to actually hit this and loft us across the top of this so that we don't get hung up over here. If you come up with me back over to that other log, I'll show you what a real kicker is. So Bret talked about this one earlier, and it turns out this isn't actually the obstacle. This part is, because we talked about if your front wheel gets down here and this thing starts rolling. This is actually a kicker. As we're approaching, you add that throttle, and what happens is your front tire hits it and it actually kicks it up into the air so that we can loft all the way to the other side, because we don't want to roll off this side. If we build a ramp, that's more of a rolling. If we're using a kicker, what we're trying to do is get the front end to loft. Now some of you might be asking, why don't you just ride a wheelie across it, Paul? Well, one, I don't know how to ride wheelies because wheelies are for hooligans. But there are occasions where we have to occasionally loft the front tire to negotiate taller obstacles on the trail. This is one of those cases. And this little bump over here and that throttle, that acceleration, is what's going to kick our tire in the air to get to the other side.
All right, I told you guys at the beginning of this video that there was a little bonus lesson at the very end. I'm going to take you back to the big log and just let you know what happened.
God, I'm sick of this walking shit.
Of the three obstacles that we were showing you, this is obviously the most intimidating. To give you some perspective of the size of this log is roughly 22 inches across, so almost 2 feet. To the center of the axle on this bike is right around 13 inches. That puts it well below the rolling point. I did end up breaking the foot peg on this, but not maybe for the reason that you might think. When I landed, the weight of my body coming down on that foot peg actually snapped it off, which we know is a problem with the old 16-17 Africa Twin. So not a surprise. We already knew it was coming, and luckily, because I was wearing proper full-size articulated boots and I had a good soft landing, I didn't lose control and I didn't injure myself. The other thing I did before I went over this is, knowing the possibility or the likelihood of things going wrong, I removed the luggage off the bike. And this is something I do when I'm teaching, and I do the same thing when I'm traveling. If I actually had to do something like this when I was traveling, I would do what I could to reduce the risk of damaging the bike or injuring myself. And when my foot came off, had it been pulled back and then caught between a bag, it could have been a much different scenario. injury, embarrassment. You know, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and obviously I don't care about breaking the bike, I care about breaking myself. Now, talking about this, the technique is exactly the same, and if you haven't caught on to this yet, rewind the video and listen to Paul again. The technique was exactly the same as the small log. The only difference is my speed of approach, and Paul told you about this. The bigger the obstacle, the slower approach. I came to almost a near stop on the approach on this so that I would have enough torque and thrust and traction to get that front end to bounce up and off and to get the back to drive over this, because I wasn't able to roll off the other side. I don't have the ground clearance. I needed to launch over this, and I do that from a low speed. Be careful, because when you practice this technique, when you go out and you use this on small logs or curbs, if you don't have an off-road area and you're practicing riding over like concrete curbs in parking lots, things like that, you want to use those so that you're riding over and everything is smooth. If things aren't smooth, the technique isn't right. You want to practice until it's perfect every time, because when you get to this and the technique is wrong, you can really hurt yourself. So the bonus lesson is the fact that you should know your equipment, and we did, but wearing the proper gear, taking precautions before you do something, it can pay dividends in the end, because even me, doing this as a professional, things go wrong, and I can get hurt just like everybody else. Thanks for watching the channel. Thanks for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, I don't know why, make sure you hit subscribe on the channel. If you want to keep it going, this is an unsponsored channel. You can support it through Patreon. There's a link there on the page. Please click on that. Offer a couple dollars a month just to keep this thing going. Paul and I are doing our best, our absolute best, to avoid...
I'm half-assing it.
We do not want to have a real job. Please help us remain gainfully unemployed for as long as possible. Thanks, guys.
Love
See
you,
you on the
folks.
trail.